Okay, so we're recording. We're going to talk about classical Chinese painting today. Really, I just want to do two things. This won't be that long of a video today. I do, though, the first thing I'm going to do is talk to you about what Chinese painting sort of is, because we have what we call genres in art. I mean, painting, very broadly speaking, is a medium of art, I suppose, and then there are genres of painting. Um, but we call this classical Chinese art painting, what we're looking at is a fairly complex object whose intentions and purposes and techniques aren't exactly the same as in the Western tradition of painting. So what I want to do then is, first of all, just for a slide, just briefly explain how it is that Chinese painting is not exactly what we think of as painting, but rather is a somewhat more synthetic art with quite a bit more things, I think, going on, although it's also very minimalistic art, as we will talk about today. And so I just want to do that briefly for a couple of minutes. And then for another few minutes, what I want to do is just give you a really quick survey of the main line of sort of classical Chinese painting from about the 6th century up to about the early modern period, and show you maybe a painter or two for every century, and just do that really quickly to give you just a sense of this art. It's a wonderful, wonderful artistic tradition. As always, and I always stress this on these videos and in class, I'll show you a few little things, but what we're looking at here involves many, many hundreds of people, many, many thousands of pieces. And today people can and do spend a lifetime studying this material. So I'm just giving you the really, really very basic introduction to Chinese painting. So let's start doing that then, if I can figure out once again how to use the damn thing. Here we go. I think that's how you do it. Okay, when I get up there, there we go. And then I'll just, I have made so many of these videos. Here we go. Again, you see it's very beautiful stuff. You see a few other things, though, just here on our sort of little front page. You see those stamps. Well, you see some calligraphy, some handwriting in the upper left, and you also see a stamp there. Interestingly, these stamps are put sometimes on these paintings by successive owners, and sometimes just as marking the provenance of the piece, and sometimes they have more symbolic significance than that. But already then you notice here that you've got pretty consistently, you're going to see this handwriting. That's one of the things we're going to talk about. Okay, so here we go, just genres and concepts in Chinese art. As I said, we might pre-reflectively just not question that, think, okay, well, there's poetry and there's music and there's painting and there's drawing and there's this and there's that. There's theater, opera is an interesting example. So we think, okay, there are just these genres and they're just sort of set there. But as we move from culture to culture, of course, that's just not at all true. We find similar techniques for similar kinds of productions and performances and pieces, but not exactly the same thing at all. And we're not looking at a typical Western painting. So let's break that down. Second bullet point on the slide. This isn't something that distinguishes ancient China from ancient Europe, by the way, or ancient Egypt even, or anywhere else. A Chinese gentleman of these centuries would have thought there was decorative narrative art, which was perhaps an art that could be performed by trained craftsmen who worked for money, and it was a business because there were things that needed to be decorated and other things that needed to be done. But then there was a higher art. Again, that's quite common in many cultures, the distinction between high art and low art. Our culture has a very strong distinction between high art and low art, not that it observes it that much, but it certainly is part of our conceptual apparatus when we talk about art, the notion of a high art or a low art. Very much true in Chinese art because it's a pretty classista society, but more importantly, it really is functional here. In China in the classical period, many professional people were involved in the civil service. After all, the civil service sort of spread into all areas of life and certainly public life. And one passed exams, and this similar to the exams you see people passing in other cultures. and you got your position. Now, you were supposed to be familiar with a number of texts. We've talked about that in some of the other videos, and there were other things you were supposed to know about, but it was equally important. Calligraphy is really important here. Calligraphy, taken that is just to say as having a handwriting, as having a practiced hand, being literate, being able to read and write, but also having a real hand, a hand that showed that you had a mastery of the symbolic form and showed that you were a member of the elite. So the quality of your handwriting, your calligraphy was very important. And a lot of these paintings, they're going to talk about reading the painting and originally and through, and you'll see that the method persists up until very late in the tradition. You have pretty minimalist, ink on paper and without color. And part of that was that there was a continuum between one's calligraphy, one's handwriting, and one's drawing, dibujo. I mean, they were, just continuously part of the same sort of thing. So painting and calligraphy and drawing are not really structured the same way that they, again, are in the way we might think of painting. And then the poetry is very important too, because you're showing your handwriting, but you're also showing that you can be a poet, another sort of high art with formal rules that has to be mastered through training. And so again, this is the way that a gentleman would be distinguished. They would be able to do this stuff, the guohua, the higher art. The last two bullet points here. So you might talk about technique, brush work or preparing your surfaces or whatever. But here's another two. For spirit resonance, this is really basic. We've been talking about a number of different elements of Chinese culture, Chinese medicine, Chinese martial arts, and above all, Chinese philosophy and Taoist philosophy and Confucian philosophy. And we've seen that central to Chinese thinking is this notion of qi energy, the flow of the qi energy. That central concept is really a central concept that we find in all of these different applications when we look at classical Chinese culture. So certainly with this representational tradition, this artistic tradition of painting, it was of the utmost that in terms of the composition, and then also has to do with the spontaneity of it. And we'll see this also when we look at Zen in Japan later. Really the thing there is spontaneous, but yeah, excuse me, spontaneous based on many, many hours and even years of practice, including copying masters, in order to develop muscle memory, the same way, say, a master violinist develops muscle memory, and that's what a master calligraphist has. So it's spontaneous, but spontaneous within the context of having, tremendously well-versed and well-trained hand. So, so I guess, my main takeaway in terms of talking about the question of genre is when we look at what we call Chinese painting, we're looking at a genre that combines drawing, calligraphy, painting, and poetry. And then, so spirit resonance, you're going to look at it qi in terms of being in touch with the flow of qi. Remember, this is also spiritual. This also has to do with the humility of the artist. And so that's going to be something that people are going to, and so you have a lot of movement. It's Chinese art. We're going to look at Chinese line. We're going to look at the classical Chinese line a bunch today, drawing. And what you're going to see is a real flowing, almost sort of cartoony flowing kind of line that's unmistakably Far Eastern, unmistakably Chinese. And that also is coming very, very directly related to Taoism and the notion of the flow of qi energy and aligning the self with the general flow of energy, not countering, not meeting force with force, but going with it. That concept is very much present in all Chinese art. So when we're assessing Chinese art, we want to remember that basic aesthetic. And then bone method is just the extension of that idea. it was uh, like it is in any culture. If the gentleman is making poetry or making music or something like that, we expect it to be good and of very high quality, and that's going to be a reflection of the very high quality of the gentleman himself, right? That's sort of the idea. And so also then we're going to look at landscapes and very austere, minimalist kind of representations, figure drawings. But as always in ancient art, that's an ancient characteristic. As always, this art is always symbolic, always has a message, always kind of moralistic, always cautionary. It's socially responsible art, because that was another important element in terms of why anybody would be doing it and why anybody else should value it. So yeah, the hand in a pictographic language, written form such as Chinese, I mean, it's extremely intricate, and as you can see, very beautiful. That is someone with a very practiced hand. Imagine being able to look at those very intricate symbols. But this person who's a skilled calligrapher will be able to make those symbols, say the one in the middle row, the second one from the left in the middle row. That's a pretty wild one. Look at any of them though, but they will be able to reproduce that symbol pretty precisely time and time again. And again, this is a very, very high art for someone to have. Most people in this society, most people in our society, if I may say so, can't really do anything like this at all. Ku Gaiji, 5th century. There's a lot of stuff even going, this is we're in the the common era, the first millennium here, but going back to the first millennium before the common era, we would find a important graphic tradition and artistic tradition here. We're just picking it up here. We call him the founder of the lineage, in the sense that here you're getting the role of art, this kind of central role of art amongst the intelligentsia. And then what I wanted to say, when we're looking at these two figures here by Gu Gaiji from the 400s, around the time of the fall of Rome, that is, look at the line, the fluidity of the line. This fluid, curvy line, think of Chinese classical representations of lions and things like that, gargoyle, the way they handle that kind of symbology. Look at the fluidity, the sort of cartoony nature of the line. And again, this has to do with the kind of naturalistic Taoist origins and attitudes of these people who, many of the artists that we're looking at, I'm not, troweling all this information in here, but quite several of the artists that we're going to look at today also wrote treatises on art, were famous diplomats. Again, this is not something where someone's just sort of a professional doing this kind of thing. These are very upper class people, many of them. And here he is. And another thing with the Chinese art is the attention to tiny details and repetition, which if you've ever made any art, you know that sometimes if you want to represent something, you're going to have to do a lot of work, a lot of minute detailed work to get that on there. And that's something that makes something that you're looking at very interesting to look at. So it gives it so much texture. And we can see that with these very fine, precise, detailed Chinese pieces. And again, look at those lines, and it's unmistakable. So here we are 200 years later, and we'll see that the line is unmistakable 200 years after that, and so on. In the same way that Egyptian art, for example, is unmistakable. It's got its own style, and once you're familiar with it, you can't really mistake it. After a while, it's pretty easy to recognize Chinese art. And then you start, pulling together distinctions about the art from different regions of Asia. You see, this is a really nice piece, drawing ink on paper. They don't use oils. You see those stamps on the left. And again, those are owner stamps that were stamped by successive owners over successive decades and even centuries. One of the reasons why people will put these stamps on the front. They're sort of treated like works in progress, and successive owners will help themselves to altering them and putting other symbols on them, and even writing messages on them. And then you have here clearly a big change in the 700s with Zhu Fang. And one thing that's happening is you start to get color coming in. You work with really basic colors, the primary colors. And then, as you know, from looking at the ceramics of China, which we did before, they then become amazing colorists. Here you see, and they will tend to be very conformist in that a color, a specific pigment or hue will become in fashion, and they'll all use the same color brown for everything or something like that. It's very formalistic. Think about tea ceremony and doing the tea ceremony exactly the right way. Moralistic landscapes, right? Moralistic landscapes. I mean, we think of landscapes as sort of maybe non-cognitive. I mean, you're just going to paint a picture of a landscape. Is there a message in the landscape? Well, in the case of Chinese landscapes, yeah, there is. There definitely is. For one thing, again, basic formula here coming out of Taoism, which is essentially a naturalistic folk tradition. And you get a heavy emphasis on naturalism and depictions of nature as ways of depicting various kinds of virtues and states of being. We also have a distinction between the North and the South in Chan Buddhism. In the Chan Buddhist cultures through these centuries, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, you had the North and the South. And you had an argument that's kind of familiar also from Abrahamic theology about grace versus works, about whether nirvana would come upon you suddenly or whether nirvana was something that had to be sort of worked on with meditation and practice to achieve. And that's a huge doctrinal argument. And the way that plays out in these landscapes is the northern landscapes would be very forbidding, giant, scary looking mountain ranges, with little tiny people down at the very bottom trying to warn you about, messing with Mother Nature, whereas the southern landscapes tended to be much more pastoral, much more benign, much more sort of celebrating the benignity of nature. So last bullet point, it was that it was so early and emphatically a genre read as metaphorical and moralistic, I think. It reflects the instinctive Chinese reading of art as being as much about the artist's philosophical perspective and personal virtues as it is about its nominal subject. That's not exactly impressionism. That's not exactly even subjectivity. That's more a kind of virtue theory, right? That is reading not the way I would look at, say, a French Impressionist painting as the artist is trying to express to me what it's like to have that phenomenal experience, but rather I'm trying to read the painting and I'm thinking about it in terms of what it's telling me about the virtues of the artist. Okay. And so, for example, and this will be probably, I suppose, one of those northern dynasties. This is the time of the northern and southern dynasties. Again, a nature as humbling to human beings, right? And so that's also that's the part of nature worship that Confucius is all right with, because Confucius thought that what he wanted was stability. So things like east, north, south, and west, things that always stayed the same, he thought those things should be observed and valued as rituals. Rituals are all about the foundation, right? Building up from what we're standing on. And then these beautiful pastoral pieces, and again, look at that handwriting. You've got those interesting seals, but then you also have the handwriting. And then, which is going to be expressing also something important that we can't get. although we can appreciate it in the same way that we can appreciate looking at the notations in classical scores by composers. Very interesting to look at. And then we can look at the foliage there and see this very minimalistic, very elegant, trying to get a lot into something as small as possible, the one and the many maybe. And these really, they had these long scrolls, and some of them were really vast and intricate pieces. If I thought this was Northern European Baroque, I would think it was some kind of wild etching. It's like paper, it's like pencil and ink on paper or silk. They worked with putting ink on silk. Imagine drawing ink on silk. I can't imagine that, but I don't know what they say silk. I'm not sure what that means. They probably have really good. Duran is, many of these people are Buddhist artists. Duran is well known as a Buddhist artist. And I'll show you this one because I really like it, but he has some really nice color tints. He does really nice things with the sky. Su Shi is, sometimes people call him the Rembrandt of Chinese art because his lines are so fine. Again, now notice we're a good, 600 or more years since we started, and we still see these empty spaces and not color and lines, just a black on the background, and Su Shi being very traditionalist this way. And again, looking at that, the thing that interests me about that is this continuum between handwriting and drawing itself, representational drawing sort of flowing into handwriting. And this is a panel. You can see that the sections. I'm not actually sure how big this is, but look at those lines. And then again, in this case, these seals will be owner's seals. They actually put it right on the drawing around the edges. This will trace the provenance, of course, of the piece. This makes something, it's a very useful tradition in terms of art history and ancient Chinese art history. And by the 1200s, the 11th century, now you see this, very impressive representational tradition is in place. And these are finely intricate. You get a sense by putting in a lot of intricate detail, you get a certain kind of texture, a certain kind of perspective. It's something that you don't see as much, I don't think, in Western painting, not Western modern painting, certainly. Now we get everything, but almost kind of like Bruegel, like some of those really, really dense, detailed paintings by Bruegel from when? From the 1600s, from the 17th century, right around this time. It's one of the things I'm going to talk about next. Right now, in fact, the Ming Dynasty, which will carry us out of the classical painting period. This is, early modern in the European tradition is going to be 15, 16, 1700s. And so it's right around the same time. Remember the 1600s, 17th century is the century of the Baroque. And so it's interesting to me that right at the same time, excuse me for a second. Okay. Let me see if I can figure out how to pause this for a second. I'm not sure if I can do that. No, I cannot. Sorry. Hang on a second. Hang with me. Okay, Fox. Come on. No, let's go. Here you go. Okay, sorry about that. My dog is just nuts. So in the movies, you might say, or you're watching movies, you're watching TV or something, and they've got one of those big crazy Chinese vases around because you're up at the rich people's house in the movie. It's the cat burglar movie or something. And they'll always say that's a Ming vase because that's the prestige. That's Ming Dynasty. That's like saying it's a piece of Baroque art from Europe. And in fact, it's from the same historical period. because the same kinds of things are happening. The longer I study world art, the more I am impressed by the synchronicity of the way that sort of the modern cultures kind of unfold. As I say, we already did this, we already looked at the ceramics, which I think are just completely unbelievable. You know, what I'm going to show you a couple more paintings now, but then we'll just be done. What's the takeaway? First of all, the genre of Chinese painting is actually a very synthetic genre, which has to do with what we would call painting and colorizing, I think. Some of it has the look of, say, watercolor, but also it is calligraphy, writing, and it also incorporates poetry. We didn't really savor or look at any of that poetry in English translation today, but that is another element. That's where you would get a poem. The poem would be presented to you in this kind of graphic medium is part of it. So that's my first point. The first point is that the genre of Chinese painting isn't what we usually think of when we think of painting, Western painting. And then the second thing I did was just to show you some of this art and show you what this is about, maybe a little bit clearer on what we're looking at. And here we get into the 1500s, period of the Renaissance. And look at that calligraphy on the right. Look at that handwriting on the right. I mean, it's easy to overlook. And again, those aren't just sort of made up creative little things, one-offs. That's the way that person wrote. That's what their handwriting looked like. And this person more than likely did a lot of important things other than just make these pieces of art. Now you're getting into the 1500s, and now we see things have gotten quite exquisite, both in terms of line, shading, tinting, and yet still look at that piece on the left. You get sort of almost a kind of graphomania, because after all, it is the medium in which the poetry and the messages are being presented. Just a beautiful, beautiful tradition with so much to enjoy. And there is that amazing calligraphy. You got not something, this person, this is what their writing looks like. How long would it take to develop a writing style like that with hundreds of these characters that you can be very articulate and expressive using it? You're a poet. A very, very high technical skill that only very, very few people in classical or medieval China had. So stop and smell the roses, look at the calligraphy, just like you should look at the score notations when you're enjoying classical music. It's part of it, and it's a beautiful tradition. So I encourage you to look into it more. And thanks for spending this time with me today. Okay, bye-bye.